Picture this. It is the early hours of a humid June morning in 1982. The kind of summer darkness that clings to your skin like a damp sheet. Toronto is sleeping, or at least pretending to. In the daylight, this city prides itself on being Toronto the Good, a sterile, polite, safe haven compared to the grit of New York or the chaos of Chicago. But night changes the geography of safety. Somewhere near the Rouge River, a place where the city's concrete arteries bleed into wild, unchecked nature, a young woman's life is being violently extinguished. The water is cold, indifferent, rushing past stones that will hold her secrets for 43 agonizing years. This isn't just a murder. It is the opening chapter of a horror story that will span decades. A story written in the invisible ink of DNA, hiding in plain sight while a predator walks the streets, grows old, and dies in a warm bed. We often tell ourselves that justice is inevitable, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward it. But tonight, we are going to challenge that comforting lie. Sometimes, justice arrives too late to be anything other than a bitter footnote. We need to talk about the terrified silence that gripped this city in the 80s. A silence that many of you might remember if you grew up hearing the warnings to never walk alone. There was a monster operating in the shadows of the 416, a man who didn't fit the Hollywood profile of a genius killer, but rather the terrifying reality of the banal predator, the guy next door, the worker you passed on the street. For decades, the files of Christine Prince, Claire Samson, and Gracelyn Greenidge sat in cardboard boxes, gathering dust in the cold case unit's archives. 3 women, 3 distinct lives, one connected thread of brutality that police wouldn't see until the technology of the future finally caught up with the failures of the past. And here is the hard pill to swallow, the controversial truth we have to confront today. While detectives worked tirelessly, the system itself failed these women. It allowed a serial predator to slip through the cracks, to live a full life, to retire, and to die of natural causes, while 3 families were left staring at empty chairs at their dinner tables. Let's step back into the world of 1982. It was a different Toronto. The skyline was lower, the subway didn't reach as far, and there was a naivety about personal safety. Christine Prince was just 25 years old. She wasn't from here. She was a Welsh girl, a nanny who had crossed an ocean to work in Canada, bringing with her that specific kind of immigrant optimism. She believed in the safety of this city. On the night of June 21st, she did what any young person should be able to do without signing their death warrant. She went out with friends. She laughed. She danced. She lived. Around 1 a.m., she boarded a streetcar at St. Clair and Bathurst. We can see her in our mind's eye, tired, perhaps humming a song from the club, clutching her purse, watching the streetlights blur past the window. She was supposed to get off at Witchwood Avenue and walk the short distance home. It was a walk she had likely done a dozen times, but that night the predator was watching. The details of what happened next are the stuff of nightmares. She was intercepted, taken from the safety of her routine, and subjected to a brutal sexual assault and beating before being discarded like refuse in the Rouge River. When her body was found the next day, it shattered the illusion of safety for every young woman in the city. A nanny, a caretaker, someone who represented innocence. And the killer? He vanished into the morning mist, leaving absolutely no trace that 1982 forensics could decipher. The tragedy didn't end there. And this is where the story gets darker, where the cracks in our society start to show. Just over a year later, in September 1983, we meet Claire Samson. Claire was 23, 2 years younger than Christine, but living a very different life. History and police reports often label her dismissively as a sex worker, a label that in the 80s unfortunately acted as a filter for public empathy. But I want you to see her as a human being, a young woman with dreams, fears, and a family who loved her. She was last seen on Jarvis Street, a notorious strip at the time, getting into a beige car. The man driving was described vaguely. Older, white, thinning hair. It was a transaction that should have been routine in the dangerous economy of the street, but instead, it was a trap. Claire wasn't found in the city. Her killer drove her north, far outside the jurisdiction of the Toronto police, to a lonely patch of woods in Oro-Medonte near Barrie. He shot her in the head, a small caliber execution. The isolation of her final moments is haunting. Unlike Christine, whose death was a public shock, Claire's murder was treated with that tragic, bureaucratic detachment often reserved for women on the margins. The connection between the nanny and the sex worker wasn't made. They were just two separate files, two separate tragedies, buried under the weight of a city that was growing too fast to care. Then, the timeline breaks. This is the part that should keep you up at night. The silence. From 1983 to 1997. 14 years. Did the monster go to sleep? Did he find God? Or did he just get better at hiding his crimes? We don't know. But we do know that in 1997, the darkness returned. Or perhaps it just surfaced again. Gracelyn Greenidge was 41 years old, a nursing assistant, originally from Barbados. She was the backbone of the healthcare system, the kind of woman who spent her days caring for others. She lived on Driftwood Avenue in the Jane and Finch area, a neighborhood that the media often unfairly villainized. But for Gracelyn, it was just home. On July 29th, she didn't show up for work. That was the first alarm bell. Reliable people don't just vanish. A coworker, worried sick, went to her apartment and peered through the peephole. What she saw was a scene of absolute horror. Gracelyn was lying on the floor. She hadn't been taken to a river or a forest. She was killed in the sanctuary of her own home, stabbed, beaten. The violence was personal, intimate, and rage-filled. And yet, despite the difference in the method, drowning, shooting, stabbing, the shadow behind the act was the same. But in 1997, the police still couldn't see the face of the man who was hunting these women. Now I want you to sit with this frustration, because it boils my blood, and it should boil yours too. We are talking about 3 women killed over a span of 15 years, and for decades there was nothing, zero, zilch. How does a man like Kenneth Smith, and let's name him now, let's drag his name into the light, how does a man like that operate in a major city without getting caught? We now know he had a history of sexual assault. He was known to police. He wasn't a ghost. He was in the system. But back then, police departments didn't talk to each other the way they do now. The senseless bureaucracy, the lack of digitized records, the sheer volume of paper files, it all created a smokescreen for him. He lived among us. He probably walked past police officers, bought groceries next to potential victims, maybe even watched the news reports of his own crimes with a smug sense of invincibility. It wasn't until 2016 that DNA finally linked the Christine Prince and Claire Samson murders. And it took another year to link Gracelyn Greenidge. That is over 30 years of freedom for a triple murderer. 30 years of sunrises, birthdays, and Christmases that his victims never got to see. Here is the controversial take that no one wants to say out loud during the self-congratulatory press conferences. Genetic genealogy is a miracle, yes, but it is also an indictment of how archaic our investigative methods used to be. The police will tell you they never gave up, and I believe the individual detectives cared, but the system gave up. The system relies on a match in a database. For years, they ran the DNA found at these scenes against the National DNA Databank, and it came back with nothing. Why? Because Kenneth Smith, despite his history, wasn't in there for a qualifying offense, or he slipped through a loophole. It wasn't until they hired a private company, Othram, to do the work that the state couldn't, tracing family trees, building a genetic profile from distant cousins, that they found him. It brings up a terrifying question. How many other Kenneth Smiths are out there right now, secure in the knowledge that their DNA isn't in the standard police database? We are relying on the hobbyist DNA of third cousins to solve the worst crimes in our history. Is that justice, or is it just luck disguised as science? And what of the resolution? On December 3rd, 2025, they finally announced it. They had their man, Kenneth Smith, but there was no perp walk. There was no trial. There was no moment where the judge read out the sentence and the families could see fear in the killer's eyes. Kenneth Smith died in 2019, a free man at the age of 72 in Windsor, Ontario. He got to live his life. He got to grow old. He essentially got away with it. Sure, the police can now close the file and say case solved, but is it? Can you really solve a murder if the murderer never answers for it? The families of Christine, Claire, and Gracelyn are left with a hollow victory. They have a name, and that is worth something. It stops the wondering. It kills the hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a monster. But it doesn't balance the scales. The universe did not punish him. He died in a bed, likely surrounded by family who had no idea they were mourning a monster. So as we look back at the lives of Christine Prince, the Welsh nanny with the bright future, Claire Samson, the young woman who deserved safety regardless of her circumstances, and Gracelyn Greenidge, the healer who was taken in her own home, we must remember them not just as victims, but as casualties of a time and a system that couldn't protect them. Their stories are a testament to the fact that evil is often banal, quiet, and patient. And while technology finally stripped Kenneth Smith of his anonymity, it couldn't strip him of his freedom while he was alive. That is the tragedy of the cold case. The truth eventually comes out, but sometimes it arrives only to find that the darkness has already moved on, leaving us with nothing but ghosts and whispers. If this story made you feel that mixture of anger and sadness, if it made you look at the cold cases in your own city a little differently, then I've done my job. We keep these stories alive, not to glorify the killers, but to ensure the women they took are never just statistics in a dusty file. I want to know what you think. Does identifying a killer after death bring closure, or is it just a painful reminder of justice denied? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to journey further into the Twilight with me, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.